Suthen, congratulations on your rite of passage fellowship essay. One thing that I do want to say before we start this interview is that the fellowship was basically your idea. You flew down from Toronto to New York. You and I came up with the idea of the fellowship. So this one does feel special because not only were you involved as a participant, but you ran the fellowship. You were the operations leader. And so you really put in most of the work behind this thing. So thank you for all your help. And let's start talking about your essay.
Yeah, super excited. And I think lots of great things have come out of this fellowship. I think if we think about the number of people who have been able to project their ideas, really put a lot of their life's work, or at least a couple of years of their life's work, and create it or out show an output in a way that is huge for a lot of people, and will hopefully change the career trajectories of a number of people in the fellowship. I'm very excited to finally see everything come to light.
Me too. So the big thesis in your essay is that cities are like old bodies. That yes, they have a lot of wisdom, which you call culture, but they have poor organs, poor infrastructure, and they don't have a focus on personal fitness because that's like poor maintenance. And what you say in this essay is that we should turn to Walt Disney and Walt Disney's original vision for Epcot, which stands for the Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow. And it was a utopian city, and it was built to inspire the next generation of what cities would look like. So talk about Disney, and why don't we begin this story with the 1964 World's Fair?
Yeah, I think cities are obviously a complex organization, right? They're like the number of leadership changes that have happened over time. I think all the different modulars within the city really make it difficult to analyze it in one go, and much less to make changes from a holistic perspective. And so when I was looking through how do you solve this problem, I was shocked to see that Walt Disney, who up until then I really took as this mastermind entertainer, right? The creator behind some of the most magical physical spaces from a theme park perspective, but never had I applied him to the ability to create cities. And so it really starts from, or, really kind of took pace from the 1964 World Fair, like you said. So basically, Walt Disney, and actually his father was part of the original World Fair in the early 1930s, I believe. And from there, Walt Disney kind of came and made the 1964 World Fair possible. And he did it in a way that was very subtle. He didn't try to have his own exhibit. He didn't try to take over the fair, but the entire fair essentially had his fingerprints all over it. And that's because he worked and partnered with a number of the large corporations in the world, like Ford, General Electric, essentially the Googles, Amazons of their time, and created, the exhibits for them. And he basically used those exhibits and brought them back to Disney World, right? And so these were all assets that were he creating, which was, again, an ingenious way of making the most out of every opportunity that he had. So he essentially got third-party corporations to give him the creative license to showcase, in Ford's case, the idea of the people mover, right? And being able to move across the entire World Fair without, the regular use of transportation, which was automobiles at the time and still is today. And then with General Electric, really showcase the city of tomorrow, right? And showcase different ways of improving infrastructure. And so he was able to, on someone else's dime, present these ideas and then use the World Fair as kind of his showcase, then take those assets back and present them back to Disney World, which is where he started this iterative approach where he was testing out different ideas, seeing what stuck, really influencing the public's mind, and then taking it to a point where towards the end of the World Fair, he essentially started to fester with this idea of Epcot, right, which is the experiential prototype community of tomorrow, right? And so the World Fair was a magical moment where he was able to put a lot of the pieces in place. And then the second piece is his meeting, or not his meeting, but his encounters with Victor Gruen's work.
Who's Victor Gruen?
So Victor Gruen, he's a really interesting character. He's best known as the person who created shopping malls, right? So if you go across the shopping malls of today and how everything is walkable, it's essentially a product experience. If you think about it, something that's scaled across North America, across the world now. And he was the architect behind it. However, the interesting part is that he later regretted that because he essentially went from a place of creating this mall, which, you know, the commercial sector took and blew up, but that was only a part of his vision, right? The shopping mall was a part of a much broader vision, which was really designed to recreate the way cities were structured. And so Walt Disney combined Victor's work with his work as an entertainer, really looking at timeless design as a concept and really built upon that. And through that came the vision of Epcot, which he, right before, literally weeks before he passed away, you know, created a documentary and showcased it to the world.
One of the things that you talk about was how, going back to the World's Fair, there was a method of transportation similar to what became the People Mover that Disney was involved with. And so when Disney begins to design Epcot, one of the things that you write a lot about in this essay is that he focused on the movement of people and not on the movement of cars. And so within Epcot, there were 4 modes of transportation: trucks, cars, the people mover, and then pedestrians. Talk about those 4 and what you observed from the relationship between them.
Totally. So one of the problems that Walt Disney highlighted in cities was traffic, right? If we look in a typical city street today, there's buses, there's people, there's cars, there's sometimes subways, right? There's trucks, everything goes through these roads and it's incredibly congested, right? And this is consistent across any city that I've been to. And that's a huge problem today. And he realized that at a time where cars were just starting to get its traction, right? Cars were essentially a status symbol, still is today, but more so during those days. And so for him to say, hold on, let's pause on the idea of cars and really focus on the purpose behind each mode of transportation. And instead of making cars the focus of our infrastructure, let's make the people or the person, the individual, the focus of the infrastructure. And so when he thought about building Epcot, he really tried to make it pedestrian-centric, right? And so the ground level would have no vehicles at all. And he was steadfast on that. He essentially made pedestrians at the ground level, right? He then below made sure that he would have different layers for different modes of transportations. And so trucks would have their own layer, and this would allow them to kind of go through as they please, probably increasing a lot of the efficiencies with the commercial transportation system. And then you had a layer for buses and more public forms of transportations. And then you also had the people mover, right? Which is essentially a much faster way of being able to move in and out of the city, move from the suburbs into the core city area. And this, again, was really novel because, and this is a concept that we're only starting to grasp, right? If you go to San Francisco, right, there's the trains that go in and out of the cities. That's something that's relatively new. However, Walt Disney looked at this as a solution and really had a structured approach so that the people mover would enable transportation in and out free of charge, accessible to everyone, right? And then you would have tiers of transportation all underground, allowing for the potential for essentially allowing for a lot of the efficiencies that can come with each mode of transportation. So putting the pedestrian at the center of the conversation instead of the automobile.
So, is what you're saying here that Epcot was Walt Disney saying, this is what the city of tomorrow should look like? And this is a proof of concept for what the cities of the future should be. My question is, Disney, so popular. Disney, everybody likes it. Disney, a name that every household knows. Why is it that Walt's ideas didn't become more popular and more rooted in American urban development?
It's really hard. I think if you think about the inertia involved in urban development versus the ability to create isolated theme parks, it's incredibly different, right? If after Walt Disney passed away, Roy Disney, his brother, right, and the rest of the team, they didn't know what to do with Epcot. They loved the idea. A lot of people love the idea. However, it's a lot of hard work to build something from scratch, right? Which is why Disney really focused on exporting the theme park idea across the world, but wasn't really able to build upon Epcot as a city, right? It essentially became another version of the theme park, really focusing on futuristic ideas, but not necessarily coming close to the purpose that Walt Disney was really trying to build on. He essentially was able to combine everything he had learned from the World Fair, from Disneyland, right? All the work involved in Disney World, as well as his work in legislation, creating all these documentaries. And Epcot was poised to be the culmination of that work. He essentially used bits and pieces from all those things that he created, right? All those moments in life. And he was able to put it all together for this grandiose vision, which was Epcot. The challenge with building from scratch is that you're pushing against all this naysayers, right? Urban development specifically has a lot of stakeholders, right? And so to be able to simultaneously work with the legislative authorities, work with the public to get their buy-in, work with fellow corporations to get their buy-in as well, and put it all together in a way that everyone wins, everyone sees the benefit of this, and actually do the work, right? There's a reason why Walt Disney was able to create Disneyland in pretty much a year to a day, right? And was not able to, and since then, no one's been able to create a feat that's, similar in nature, right? If we task our best engineers with creating Disneyland today, especially in a state like California, it'd be next to impossible, right? And it's for those very same reasons. It's because there's so many stakeholders involved. Building is just very tough for people, and building a city that involves a lot of stakeholders is incredibly tough. And my hope is that we use Walt Disney's stories, Walt Disney's vision to really take another look at cities, because if we can solve this problem, a lot of people will benefit from it.
Yeah, you talk about documentaries. So I know he had a documentary for presenting the plan for his city, and this is an interesting layer to what you're saying, that Disney wasn't just a builder. He, you could even say, was a propagandist. He studied Edward Bernays, who wrote a book that came out in 1922 called Propaganda, which began to birth the public relations industry. And Disney, as a builder, understood both vision and marketing. Talk about the intersection of those two and what Disney was trying to achieve through the media that he produced, and maybe even get into Alice in Wonderland a little bit.
Totally. I think it's very hard to be one, right? Even just being a great builder, a great marketer. Walt Disney, to your point, was a combination of both. And that's incredibly rare. And he was able to do it in animation. He was able to do it when he was creating theme parks. And he was lining up all the pieces to do it for building cities, right? And so when you think about building, I think his reputation is fairly known. When you think about marketing and specifically public relations, he was able to shape the public's mindset around a lot of his key ideas, right? So if we think about a lot of the documentaries that he's created, whether that is the Magic Highway USA, more recently Epcot documentary, he was able to educate the public on key ideas that all formed to be a really important part of his vision for Epcot, right? And when the very first evidence of this was Alice in Wonderland. He essentially created a TV series around this show, and then he built it into a movie, right? And he was able to do this at a time where TV was like VR, right? TV wasn't that popular. Like less than 1% of households were onto TV at that time, right? And then even later, less than 1% had color television, right? And he was an extremely early adopter of both technologies and almost insisted that every documentary, every TV series that he created really had all of those elements. And so even if you watch it today, they don't feel that far off. They don't feel like they were created 70 years ago, right? And that is a remarkable feat for someone who wasn't meant to be in this place. If you think about where Walt Disney came from, he started off as an animator. He made a massive switch into theme parks, and then he was poised to make another switch into city building, right? And so his transformation as a leader from a building perspective and a marketing perspective is remarkable. And he used a lot of the same techniques, right, in terms of creating Disneyland, then creating Disney World, and finally putting a plan in place to create Epcot. And so that transition to me as an individual is remarkable. And he really highlighted a lot of the key pieces needed to make this vision a reality.
Yeah, one of the things that I found really interesting in your essay was it wasn't even just imagination. It wasn't even just marketing. What he did was through the Reedy Creek Improvement District, he worked with the state of Florida to get special concessions. And there were particular reasons that he chose Central Florida as the place for Disney. If you were to go back to 1950, Orlando wasn't this hot spot that it is now. I flew down to Orlando a couple months ago, and a solid 1 in 5 people on my flight from New York City were going to Disney World. Woo! And the same thing when I would go down to Orlando and I would get to go to the Magic Kingdom. I'd get to go ride Splash Mountain, Space Mountain. I remember one of the best nights of my entire life. I was probably 12, 13 years old. And my dad had a friend from college, and his name was Dick Wiedenbeck. And so what we would do is we would go down, and Dick worked for Disney and for years. And so he had this unlimited Disney pass, and it was like this special card where we didn't have to pay. We could go to any park, and it was, I must have been 13. I bet my sister was 11. And we were at the Magic Kingdom right before the park was going to close. So we were probably there from 9:30 to midnight. And I distinctly remember the last hour. We would get off of like a Splash Mountain. We would run. There were no lines. We would run to the front, and we'd do it over and over and over again. And Disney has this certain magic to it. I went back in college. I took a business and NASCAR class in college. And so as part of the class, we went down to Disney World. And I was there with all my college buddies. And even as 20-year-olds, we had a blast. Anyway, I digress. So going back to, I just love that place. This guy's a genius. Going back to Central Florida, what happened with this, and why was Disney able to have so much control? I mean, you get into Disney, and it feels like a whole new world, basically. It feels like its own jurisdiction, and there's reasons behind that.
Totally. So, I mean, just before I get into that, I think everyone has their own personal Disney story.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that's the magical part about Walt Disney, that very few, if any, entrepreneurs have been able to recreate. And I think that's exactly why I wish he was able to fulfill his dream of creating Epcot. Because if he took that same timeless design, that same experience and brought it into a city, who knows what he would have been able to accomplish. But I mean, going back to your question, I think Walt Disney was not just able to, again, be a great builder, be a great marketer, but now be a great stakeholder with the public government, right? Florida, to your point, at that time was empty lands. They basically were able to buy a massive swath of land for next to nothing. And that allowed them to be extremely creative and work with the state government, work with the local districts to essentially create legislation that allowed him to control the entire experience. I think one of the lessons he had learned from creating Disneyland is that even though he was able to create such a great theme park, the experience outside of the theme park wasn't amazing. And that really bothered him. I think he was really frustrated with the fact that outside of the theme park, there were vendors, there was pollution, garbage, just stuff that would take away from the experience and was truly outside of his control. And so now going to Disney World and essentially Epcot, he wanted to remove any potential issues with that. And so he was able to work with the Florida state government and really influence them, created all these different sessions and spoke with the local officials and really create a partnership where he had the leeway to essentially run his own government, right? If you think about, without the need for charging taxes, if you think about, making Walt Disney and the Disney Corporation control the entire region, control infrastructure, control water, really give them the leeway to innovate and test out all these different ideas, he was able to get approval for all of that. And that speaks to the trust that Walt Disney was able to create. If we compare it to similar projects today, like Sidewalk Labs in Toronto, right, and many other projects across the world, no one's been able to create that level of trust, right? And that manifested itself into the Reedy Creek district, right? And that allowed him to essentially control the entire region, be able to do whatever he wanted pretty much from a city building perspective and from a theme park perspective. And that's allowed him to really control the entire experience. And I think when you think about that magical experience where everything seems just perfect, that's about timeless design, right? And that's something that Walt Disney was crazy about. He paid attention to every single detail. He made sure that the structure was in a way that no matter where you sat, no matter where you stood, there was a key focus, right? Where everyone was looking at the same thing and it looked perfect from all sides. And it nearly brought him bankrupt, right? And so that's where he got really creative in terms of his financing, in the case of Disneyland, using a partnership with ABC to finance the creation of Disneyland, which is essentially a marketing technique for him. In fact, he should have been paying ABC to display his TV shows, but it worked out so that ABC funded his project and allowed him to market for free as well. And so he used all these different tactics to essentially commercialize his ideas and worked with the government to take control over the entire experience, which, again, if he brought to city building, would have been incredible.
Yeah, a couple comments. So you write that March 1954, with that ABC television show, there were almost 55 million television sets in America. More than half of them turned into the show. So there were more than 28 million people who were watching this show, and it ended up winning an Emmy. So this was a good show. People tuned in, and like you said, it was free marketing. Now, in terms of the timeless principles design, and this goes into Disneyland, which Walt Disney did get to see before he died. The Sleeping Beauty's castle was inspired by the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. And what Disney wanted to do was he wanted to basically create this enclosed environment where he said that he wanted people to enter the park going under tunnels as if they were undergoing like a hypnotic state. And that's what you feel when you go to Disney World. You go in and the street signs change and the restaurants change and everything has this veneer, this gloss of Disney going over it. And he created an entire world devoted to these characters. But as we begin to close, I want to talk about what is the point here. You talk about Paul Romer and charter cities. You give the example of Lavasa, and you give the example of Shenzhen. You give the example of Sidewalk Labs in Toronto. What I hear you saying is you want to be building new cities that stretch the imagination of the human mind. But you talk a little bit about the problems, the failure of Lavasa, the sterility and the intense work ethic of Shenzhen, the privacy issues of Toronto. Where do you see all this going?
Yeah, I think there's a lot we can learn from Walt Disney's plan, and I think it comes down to his innovative features, right? If we think about the tiered transportation system, if we think about the people mover, all of which he was able to accomplish back in 1950, 1960. Mm-hmm. So technically, it's possible, right? There's also the legislative control that he was able to create, right? So working with the local governments, essentially creating this district improvement plan that gave him way to kind of create all these infrastructure layers, right? Really rethink how to build all of this, essentially create this underground system in the case of Disney World, right? And lastly, creating a, so I mean, before that, I think, creating a, public influence around this, really shaping people's minds and being able to get them to rally around these ideas, almost creating a following, an audience well before the idea was even created. And lastly, the missing piece to me that a lot of people, especially in the case of like Labasa, to an extent in Shenzhen, was creating the sense of place, right? When we think about Disney and think about the theme parks that he was able to create, no matter who you talk to, no matter any of the reviews that you read, you get this unique sense of place that is very different. You cannot relate it to any other city. You cannot relate it to any part of your life, but is just something that, people say is simply magical, right? And I think when we think about that sense of place, it's different for every city, right? New York has its own sense of place. Toronto has its own sense of place. California has its own sense of place. And when we think about creating cities, that's something that we need to think about creating. And how do you create that culture within cities, right? So that you're not just building infrastructure, you're not just thinking about creating the next biggest skyscraper, right? You're thinking about building this incredible sense of place that is unique to that area.
Yeah.
And I think so long as you focus on creating that alongside great infrastructure, alongside great partnerships, both public and private, and thinking about the individual or the pedestrian public in mind, you have the formula for an incredible city. And I think that's what Walt Disney shows us. And I think that's what we can learn as we think about building cities in the future, which I think is something we will absolutely have to do in order to progress as a civilization. Cities are just far too important for us to just ignore, for us to put patchwork and Band-Aid solutions on. And I think that's where we have a lot of room to improve, but we have the answers right in front of us, courtesy of Walt Disney.
So then, congratulations on your essay. That's beautifully said.
Thank you.